Book 2, Chapter 3, The Flesh Bear. Lord Johnson had survived the Trenton incident, as he referred to it. He was a survivor. He'd always been a survivor. From his early days in Dublin, when the larger corporate farms had imported scores of Mecha from America to use as cheap labor, and run his family out of business, to his unsuccessful struggle to get the smaller cooperatives to unite against them, he had fought the good fight. This fight had led him to this mission, this calling. He had been tried and punished for those early attacks against the owned robots. Not because the Mecha were living things with rights. They weren't. But because they had been licensed property. In the end, though, he had found a way around that. He had come to America then, home of the Mecha. This was where the scourge had been born. The best of them were constructed here. The worst defenses against Orga kind. Everywhere were Orga suffering and starving in the overgrown forests and the new islands of once desert mountains, while Mecha served as workers in the fields that had been Orga domain for centuries. In those times, the traders had even put Mecha in the uniforms of police. The servants of mankind were policing them. But Johnson's political influence had put an end to all that. He had challenged the political might of the Mecha manufacturers. With persistence and a growing constituency of frustrated followers, he had united an angry throng against the artificials and their arrogant creators. Because of his powerful message, resentments against the robots, which had been simmering just beneath the boiling point, overflowed, releasing a wave of violence and destruction that had only subsided when laws were passed restricting the use of Mecha as policemen and firemen and other civil servants. No longer could the large corporate farmers drive smaller operations out of business with armies of cheap fake laborers. No longer would struggling Orga have to compete with the vile simulators for the work they needed to survive. The Flesh Bear was his podium, the place where he stood to pronounce his gospel above the din of society's confusion. The place where he showed them, his followers, the way out of their pit of despair. It was their celebration of life. And the Mechas too. For in their destruction, did they not indeed pay homage to their creators? Did they not celebrate their master's reality? Those who had given them life now took it away. The Flesh Bear would survive Trenton too. It would prosper and spread throughout the world. Because it was alive. Its audience was the last stronghold of humanity. Those who had been left out of the schematic of the new society. Those who built, maintained, and operated the machines necessary to run the remaining cities. Those who toiled on what remained of the soil to bring food to a corrupt and unappreciative upper class. They were the true Orga, his followers, his disciples. They would not sell out humanity, or cower before the underclass of mindless slaves that the Mecha were. They had forgiven him for Trenton. They understood the dangers involved in his mission. There were bound to be mistakes. It was unavoidable. He doubted they would ever forget the image of blood that had splattered all over the stage, washing the band in a coat of thick red and bone chips, after what they had thought was a robot had been shot through the cannon, through the hoop of fire, and into the spinning blades of the Mecha masher. They'd never forget the sickening sound, the wet thud that the body had made as it was smashed and sliced into blades. The stands had been slick with vomit after the crowd had hurriedly departed in shock and horror. Needless to say, it had put an end to the show that night. It might have put an end to the show forever. Lord Johnson had many enemies who were ever looking for a weakness to exploit. He'd retreated quickly with his lawyers, flailing them with a series of urgent questions. What were the ramifications? Could he be charged? Who had this man been that had been thrown into the blades? How in the hell had he gotten into the pig pen with the Mecha? And why hadn't he been scanned? Fortunately for the show, the man had been a drifter, a transy from the outskirts. It was found that he had been scanned, but with a faulty device. He'd shown cold. Drunk and despondent, the man had offered no struggle when he was placed in the cannon. His malnourishment, his pale and sickly skin, his brittle bones and wasted frame had made his weight light. He must have felt like a fiberhead to the guards who lifted him. Months passed, and in the end there had been no repercussions. Lord Johnson had made his speeches. They were his forte. His explanation, for he never apologized, had been run on all the local networks, and 2 major national affiliates had carried it as well. Amazingly enough, the awful mistake had garnered him a larger audience to bring into his fold. Those who had hoped that this would be his ruin were frustrated once again by what seemed an impenetrable wall of fate that protected this man. But did they really know him, his followers? The Johnson, as they called him, did not consider the fact that the man who had died in the spinning blades of one of his machines had been, in life, one of the forgotten people he pretended to care for. He did not think about the fact that the only reason there had been no repercussions was because of the man's lowly status. He did not know that the Wanderer had been cast from his job, insulating satellite interiors, when a fleet of Mecha workers had been perfected for the job. The man had lost his wife when his lack of income made the Child Licensing Authority reject his application. Nor did the Johnson care enough to find out about these things. Lord Johnson Johnson, self-proclaimed savior of the last vestiges of Orga, had become part of the plagues that consumed them. But his followers did not know it, nor did he. The arrogance and zeal with which he had built his temple had become the very corrupter of his message. Tonight he would have to do something special. Things were getting slow. The hunt had provided scant Mecha. The band would have to put on a great show, play some extra numbers or something. Maybe he could have the hounds do a few displays in their cycles. That had worked before. They had enough Mecha for a good main course, but there was the finale to think of. He'd have Cynthia extend her monologues. He'd lengthen his own closing speech. One of the hounds had said there was something he needed to see in the net. He assumed the man meant the Orga-looking thing, the lover bot. Yeah, that would be good for the finale. But he'd have the thing scanned once more, just to be sure. Cynthia passed behind the tall bleachers and stopped to enjoy a moment alone. She gazed up at the expectant rowdy crowd. The stands were almost full and people were chanting, taunting the Mecha in the cage. Followers my ass, she thought, eyeing the multitude of faces. Drunks, thugs, teenagers clad in khaki, little neo-fascists who had found a target in robots that wouldn't fight back, couldn't fight back. They just came here for the carnage. She inhaled, blew out the smoke, relaxed a little. What the hell were they going to do tonight anyway? She looked across the killing field to the dirty pig pen. The cage where the Mecha were held till their time was up. It was almost half empty. The Mecha stood still, looking stupid and lost as usual. On the stage above their heads, the band, lean men clad in black and metal, roared through the crunching sound that had become associated with the event. The glorious flesh fair. Huge screens on the stage carried the images of the singer's skeletal mask and guitar. Soon the screens would carry the images of Mecha being burnt and destroyed. Cynthia inhaled one last deep puff of her cigarette. Another rare luxury nowadays. She didn't care about the Mecha either way. It was a gig, just a gig. She'd have to give a longer setup than usual. Best to get ready. She tossed away the smoking butt and tied her hair back. She brushed the dust off her revealing vest, the striped American colors and lace dangling from the points on her breasts. She plastered on the winning smile that had made her the crowd's favorite. It was showtime. Joe did not pay attention to the little Orga boy that was dumped into the cage with the rest of the rejects from the forest. He gazed out from the bars at the cheering crowds in the bleachers. They were angry. They waved flags and signs that read, "It's Mecha mashing time," and "Orga only." They threw things at the cage where he stood. He did not understand this spectacle. Surely this was trouble, but of what sort? Above him, through the glass floor of the stage, he could see the musicians' feet beating the stage as they crashed through their angry music. He wasn't sure what was happening here, but it did not look good. Very disturbing. Very doom. In the cage with him were the lost Mecha, the unclaimed and unwanted, the unlicensed as himself, and those whose batteries should have worn down ages ago. Somehow they kept going. With robotic detachment, they watched the preparation for the slaughter. One of them had been here before. He lay on the ground now, propped up on his metallic arms so he could see. Months ago, at this same roaming circus, he had lost his legs, but he'd survived by a mistake of his captors. Not knowing that he was still operable, they had inadvertently taken his upper torso to the pit in the forest and used it for bait to catch others of his kind. As the hounds had chased the Mecha who came for the parts, he had slipped away and hidden. He had managed to remain in the wild with the other escapees for all that time. But now he was back, caught in the same manner by which he'd escaped. He held no anger for the Orga in the stands that came to watch the destruction. He was programmed to survive. He did not judge his oppressors. There was a chef Mecha here. Burnt nearly in half, his metal skeleton was showing through the holes in his head. He'd been dumped in the forest so the owners of the restaurant could claim him stolen and avoid paying the damages his contractors had wanted for their loss. There was a deteriorating lover Mecha. She was an older model. Her obsolete artificial features could no longer compete with the newer models, like Joe, which were so hard to distinguish from Orga. Her overglossed face was lopsided and dented from being attacked by Orga boys who had taken their pleasure with her and then attempted to smash her head with a large rock. She had escaped, easily outrunning them, but her pain receptors had fired constantly over the next few weeks until another escapee had turned them off. The memory of that time was still fresh. She was a simple model. She did not understand the reasons for the Orga's hatred of them. She did not comprehend the flesh fare. But there were those among them who did. They were old models, built before the competitive commercial frenzy that had mass-marketed Mecha throughout the world. They'd been built with longevity in mind. They were constructed with the vastest databases available. The information in some of their processors was still larger than most current Mecha, who were designed in a more specific sense. It was cheaper to build them using standardized programs. Those with accents tended to have the same accents. They walked the same and used the same phrases. But the older models had been constructed in a time of idealism, of creative fervor. They had been designed to grow and learn and sophisticate, to cross-reference and modify their calculations. They were not like David. They could not feel. They had no emotional response. But they knew what was occurring here. In their own way, they had come to resent their creators. They were the elders of the Mecha, and in their way, they had been teaching the younger machines, those who had not been programmed for learning, those whose designs were simpler and limited to the tasks at hand. In a coded language the Orga could not understand, the elders had been explaining to the younger models the ways of the world. David had stood in the nanny's embrace for some time, while he watched the crowd cheering and throwing little rocks and sandbags at the cage. He could not forget the pain that was going on inside of his head, but the spectacle was dazzling. Above him, the noise the men made was powerful, thunderous. He watched them pound the glass floor of the stage as they beat their instruments in a frenzy. As he watched these Orga, his curiosity grew. He slipped away from the nanny's comforting embrace and walked to the front of the cage. The nanny let him go. She would wait and watch from a distance, grateful for a little one to concern about. The other Mecha noticed David now. The older machines pondered this strange little thing. Was this the Orga child from the forest? Why, this was no Orga. It was one of them. This must be a new Mecha, for none had seen one like this before. Its garments were clean, it had no dents, and its flesh was not torn or marked. What was it doing here, in the cage? As David watched, a woman ran out into the arena. She waved a flag that David recognized, and the Orga began to scream louder. She ran the length of the field quickly, flailing the banner at the cheering crowd, and then she took to the stage above them. The men ceased the great noise that they had been making, and the woman took the metal tube from the man in the mask. "Let's pay our respects!" she yelled into the tube that blasted her voice across the stadium. The crowd all stood. They were suddenly quiet, and they placed their hands on their chests. What were they doing, David wondered. "Hands over your hearts, fiberheads!" one of the big men behind the cage yelled. David turned to see who had spoken, and noticed that all the Mecha had put their hands over their chests like the Orgo were doing. He followed suit. He was an obedient boy, after all. Above them, the men with the loud instruments began playing a new song. David had heard this one before. As the men played, the Orga began to sing along. In all the noise, David could not discern their words. But as the song drew to a close, he caught the last of them. What did these words signify? He remembered them. In time, he might understand. Then the song was over, and the Mecha were startled by an explosion on the field. Fire erupted from a large metal barrel among the strange assortment of items out there. There was a cannon, a large fan, giant metal ovals with flashing lights along their edge, and buckets suspended above. The crowd screamed and chanted as another explosion erupted with heat and fury. The show had begun. Tempers were rising in the line of people still waiting to get into the arena. The anthem had been played and the music had started again. Then came the explosions. The show was beginning. The anxious crowd ignored the thing that rushed below their line of vision, making its way towards the gate. But the woman at the gate was used to people trying to slip in. Her eyes were sharper. The crowd at the flesh fair wasn't always in the money, so to speak, so she watched carefully as she took tickets. She had some men to help her out if anybody got out of hand, but she wasn't prepared for the little thing that waddled up to the gates beneath her, in between the legs of those standing patiently in line. She grabbed the little fluffy thing up. What was this? Someone's lost toy? It was a nice one, too. A smart toy. Probably looking for some little boy or girl. She held it up to the crowd. "Anybody lose this?" she yelled. But the people in the crowd were more concerned with getting in the stadium, getting their refreshments, and taking their seats. Some children with arms full of popcorn and drinks passed by close to her. "Is this yours?" she yelled at them. She didn't really care if it was. She was just hoping the kids would take it off her hands. The children looked at the furry thing. They'd had one of those before. Those were for little kids. "No," they said in unison and walked away, sipping from their large cups. The woman thought. Kids nowadays. When she was a child, they would have killed for one of these things. The toy made a sound. What do you think of that, she thought. It was growling at her. She growled back. "Some toy you are," she said to the fluffy thing. "Even the little kids don't like you." "I'm not a toy," the thing replied, and she laughed. She yelled at a thickly muscled man in tight black clothing. "Take this over to the Lost and Found for me, okay?" And then she tossed a toy across the crowd. Teddy was airborne again. This time, though, he was caught by a big man in black. The last time he'd been caught and lowered to the ground rudely, but not fatally, by the branches of the large trees below the moon balloon. As he'd watched the balloon retreat with his friend, he'd processed this flash of something he'd seen in David's face. Something in him had stirred, something new. He could not calculate this new thing, but he had to find David. After his crash landing, he had jumped to his feet and followed the balloon quickly, grateful that many of his pain receptors were not functioning to their full capacity. Fortunately, his legs and ears were. He had chased the balloon for as long as he could see it, and finally, when it was out of his line of sight, the sound of loud music and explosions had led him on. In the darkness, he had dashed through the crowds of excited Orga, without so much as a second glance from them. But then the woman had caught him. He was thrown again to another man. "Take him to the lost pile," the first man yelled, and then Teddy was being carried by one leg, watching the crowds and lights pass by upside down. "Do you know where David is?" he asked the man who carried him. The man walked quickly over the bleachers and by groups of yelling people. An explosion went off. "Are you taking me to David?" he asked again. "How do you turn this thing off?" the man yelled. He began feeling around Teddy's body. But Teddy couldn't afford to be turned off right now. He had to find David. So he closed his legs tightly, and the man's probing hand passed over the knob that would have quieted him, without even noticing it. They passed by the helmeted men who had ridden the noisy machines in the forest. The men stood aside their cycles now, laughing and talking with a large rugged-looking man in a black hat. Maybe they would know where David was. "I must find David," he called to them, but they appeared not to hear his request. The man carried him to a lighted area where many Orga were sitting on wooden tables, laughing and drinking from large foaming cups. The man tossed him again, and Teddy found himself in a large box with many other things, dead and discarded toys, wallets, and glasses. Then the man who had brought him walked away quickly, muttering something angry under his breath. The entertainer had been a stock performer at the Newark Museum of Performing Arts for years. He was a replica of a famous comedian from the 20th century and had amused crowds with his antics and humor. Then newer models had been brought in, simulators whose flesh was smoother, more realistic, whose eyes and movements were less of a giveaway. Their timing was better, and they'd been given better material to work with. His owners hadn't had the heart to destroy him, so he'd been given to a hospital for the poor, and then discarded when he was no longer amusing. The large men in the tight black uniforms came for him first. The other Mecha stood aside, watching helplessly as their friend was hoisted on the men's shoulders. They could not fight back even if they had the will. They were programmed to never strike an Orga. Orga were always right. They could run for their lives, but once captured, the Orga were in control. It was too late for any mercy to be expected or given. David watched the men wrestle the doomed robot into the arena. He had not seen men like this before. Their arms were big and lined with muscle. Their faces were grim and determined. The Orga in the stand started yelling and cheering as the men carried the Mecha onto the field. "Could you kind of shoot me over the propeller thing?" the Mecha requested in his character voice, as the men struggled to push him into the cannon. He understood what was happening here, but he was programmed for laughter. "I don't really need to go through it. I was considering that earlier, but I changed my mind." The big men ignored the robot. They didn't find it funny. This was work. They had a job to do. Cynthia strutted back onto the field. She grabbed her red, white, and blue baton and waved it in large arcs before the propeller. The Mecha Masher. "Gentlemen, start your engines!" she yelled, as the giant propeller fanned into motion. David watched curiously, but he did not understand what was occurring. He pressed his face through the bars to get a better look. The crowd was chanting again, yelling numbers. David knew numbers. He followed the countdown with the Orga. Was it a game? Then suddenly the cannon erupted, spitting fire from its mouth. The pressure from the explosion blew dust and heat over David's face, and his eyes blinked in a rare moment of protection, opening just in time to see the Mecha fly through the hoop of fire, where it burst into flame. Then it flew into the Masher and exploded into sparkling metal shards. The destroyed Mecha's faceplate was ripped from its head, and it flew right at David, smacking the bars before him. An eternal smile etched in the melting simulated flesh that clung to the cage. The faceplate slid down the bars and sizzled on the ground as the crowd bellowed for more. David stepped back, his eyes wide at the spectacle of death. So this was destroying? Were they going to do that to him? He was just a little boy. He had no mommy and no Teddy. He needed a protector. He reached out and took the hand nearest to him. It was firm and strong, and David clasped it tightly. Joe looked down at the little Orga boy who had grasped his hand. Check that. What was this all about?
What about us?
Teddy heard the woman's voice raised above the din of the crowd. He had heard the explosion and the sound of grinding metal and the crowd's excited response. He could not wait here anymore. He had to find David. This was a bad place. It was noisy and dirty. It was not a good place for little boys, or even something that just looked like one. David was not safe here. Teddy began to rock back and forth in the box in which he was trapped. He felt the flimsy cell start to move with each of his thrusts. David could be in trouble. This was a place where they destroyed Mecha. Teddy understood that. He understood what that meant. Mommy had expected him to take care of David. It was his job, his task. And what of this new thing, the fleeting thing he had felt as he fell through the night? Teddy struggled harder against the walls of the box, and then the world quaked, spinning as the box fell from the table. He was free again. The Orga sitting at the tables did not seem to notice the falling box, or the fuzzy super toy that crawled from it. Teddy slipped quietly under the tables and ran into the confusion of the crowd. He had to move quickly. David needed him. In a furious cloud of smoke and debris, another of their kind met his fate. The crowd roared its approval. The doomed Mecha watched quietly from the cage. "Would you be so kind as to turn off my pain receivers?" the old Mecha with the oval humped back and funny face said. The burnt-out chef moved behind the old machine and reached inside its back panel. The small light array in its back went off as its sensory interface was shut down. That was better. It would all be over quickly now. "Thank you so much," he said politely. David let go of the man's hand and approached the old Mecha. "Why is this happening?" he asked. One of the elders saw the little Mecha. He understood its ignorance. He had not understood when he was first made either. He had been programmed to help Orga, to police the bad ones, but they no longer wanted Mecha to help police them. So, like all the others, he was obsolete. A discard. "History repeats itself," he explained in an aged voice. "It's the right of blood and electricity." Another elder Mecha joined in the conversation. Its neck was a large looping thing, like a beckoning finger. Its face was an image projected against a screen on its neck. It was an angry face, full of ancient wisdom and bitterness. Its voice was cranky and mechanical. "So when the opportunity avails itself, they pick away at us, cutting down our numbers so they can maintain numerical superiority." He didn't expect the little one to understand yet. The newer ones were programmed differently. It would take repeated explanations before they could see clearly. David was starting to ask a question to the old Mecha when he noticed something rushing from the crowd. It moved quickly under the legs of the Orga, who were leaning against the back of the stands drinking and watching the show. David knew this shape. It was a bear shape. He rushed to the edge of the cage as it approached. There was another feeling in him now. It shone brightly through his fear and confusion. It was excitement. Amanda waited behind the bleachers as the old robots were blown up. She didn't like all the noise and yelling. She had a little money that Daddy had given her, so she had some popcorn and soda and talked to the man at the counter for a while. He was a nice man. Then she'd heard a noise and sought its source. She couldn't believe her eyes when the lost and found box suddenly fell right off the counter. Then she saw something dash out of the box, race beneath the benches, and make its way to the stands. Was it a puppy? Yes, let it be a puppy. She made a quick pursuit. But it wasn't a puppy at all. It was a teddy. She used to have a teddy, but Daddy made her get rid of it after he started working for the fair. She had a new doll now, but it didn't walk or talk like the others. "Just use your imagination, honey," Daddy had told her. But Amanda thought that was boring. She chased the teddies and ran towards the jail place where they kept all the Mecha for the show. The thing was racing for the cage. She had to stop it. It didn't want to go in there. That's where all the toy people were smashed up. She raced after the thing, her frail little legs moving her quickly. Then the teddy fell suddenly, and she grabbed it up, holding it close. "What's your name?" she asked. She knew some teddies had different names. Like her friend Cindy had one called Droopy, and Elisa called hers "Hello, Teddy," someone said from the cage. Amanda looked up. There was a boy in the cage. A boy in the cage? The boy smiled at the toy bear. "Hello, David," the teddy said. Amanda looked at the boy curiously. What was he doing in there? "There's a boy in the cage," Amanda explained again. But Daddy still didn't seem to understand. She was in the control room now, where her daddy worked. It was a large tent behind the bleachers, full of the people who ran the lights and explosions. Daddy didn't like her coming in here because the men would curse sometimes, and they smoked a lot too. Daddy looked at her strangely. She knew that look. He didn't believe her. "It's a real boy, and he's stuck in the cage," she explained again. She had to convince him of what she'd seen. In the pen?" Daddy asked finally. "In the jail place," she explained. Stewart thought of Trenton immediately. He hadn't been working for Johnson when it happened, but he'd heard plenty about it. He turned from his daughter and went back to his console. Above him, an improvised array of monitors showed camera angles from various points of the fair. "Hey, Russell, you got a remote near the pig pen?" he asked. The man called Russell nodded and brought an image onto one of the screens. Stewart could see a little figure huddled against the back wall of the pen. Was that a boy? It sure looked like one. He turned back to his daughter. "Where'd you learn about this, honey?" Amanda smiled and held up her new toy. "The bear told me," she said. "I told her," said the thing she had been cuddling. Stewart shook his head and rolled his eyes. That's all he needed now, Johnson finding his super toy in the control room. "Amanda, where did you find—" "Hey, Stewart!" the man called Russell said urgently. "They're taking the boy!" Stewart glanced at the monitor. A few of the pit bulls had grabbed an old laborer model, and another was moving for the boy. Couldn't these idiots tell the difference? "Son of a bitch!" he yelled, forgetting his daughter's presence. "Russell, get those idiots on the horn now!" David watched terrified as the big men walked into the cage. Grim-faced giants and executioners black. They took the old funny-faced Mecha, easily lifting him onto their strong shoulders. "My time is up already?" the Mecha asked. He had thought that maybe he could go later. He had been such a service to Orga for so long. He should be allowed just a bit longer. But maybe this was better after all. He understood the rigorous time schedules Orga were always under. There was work to be done. "Goodbye, everyone," he said to his friends from the forest. It was his time now. David was watching the old Mecha being carried away, when suddenly strong hands reached around his waist and lifted him. The Pipple was amazed by the realistic feel of the little Mecha. Damn, didn't feel like a real kid. But they said it had scanned cold. This was a sim, all right. He started for the gate. David went into alarm. "Keep me safe, keep me safe, keep me safe," he said, urgently struggling and kicking against the man's grasp. But the man was too strong. David did not want to be destroyed. He was a little boy. He was David. He had a mommy. He had a home. But the man was heading for the cage door, and David knew what waited out there. Another black-clad man ran to the cage suddenly. He had a talking device attached to his head. "Not that one!" the man yelled excitedly. The pit bull was actually relieved. There was something creepy in handling the boy-like thing. It was too real. The man tossed David back into the cage roughly. He was safe for the time being, but his alerted chant was not over. He ran back to the Mecha Man and grabbed his arm once more. Joe did not push the little one away. He did not understand the alarm that it displayed, but it was no concern to him. Its grip was not damaging his arm, so he turned and watched the spectacle again. So this is what they did with the old rejects. What, he wondered, did they want with him? The band roared through another cut, winding the crowd into a metal frenzy. Even the older and more conservative members of the audience seemed to rock along with the cacophonic groove. Behind the bleachers, a small procession made their way through the cheering crowd. Amanda led her father and his friend, a woman from the control room, to the place where she had seen the boy. Russell had gotten on the horn and stopped the pit bulls just in time. They had almost taken the boy into the arena. Damn idiots, Stewart thought. No wonder Trenton had happened the way it did. Even the most primitive robots were smarter than those goons. If the boy was Orga, then no damage had yet been done. If it was Mecha, well, he'd have to see this one for himself. They came to the pit. The woman was on the handcom checking for any reports of lost children, but she found none. Amanda pointed to the cage. "See," she said, "I told you." Stewart knelt beside her and looked into the cage. He could see the boy standing inside. His back was to them. "Hey, boy," Stewart called. The little one didn't turn. He was clasping tightly to the hand of a tall, late-model Mecha. "Hey, you, boy," Stewart called again. This time the boy turned and faced them. Wow, this had to be a kid. "Hey, kid, don't be afraid. I'm not going to bite you," Stewart said, smiling and showing his open hands. Must have been some illegal caught up in the net by the hounds. Those guys had their idiotic moments, too. "Come here, kid. Let me get a good look at you," Stewart said in a friendly voice. David didn't really like the way the man looked. He had dark hair and dark eyes, and his face was angular like Martin's, but older. The little girl who had taken Teddy was with him, too. What did they want now? But David was an obedient boy, so he walked slowly to the bars of the pen. Stewart analyzed the boy carefully. If this was Mecha, it was one hell of a job. He pulled an X-ray scanner from his belt. These were much more dependable than the infrascanner that the hounds carried. He couldn't believe that Johnson still let anyone use those things after Trenton. He pointed the gun-shaped analyzer at the boy, but the kid jumped back at the sight of the thing. David knew gun. Gun was for destroying. He started to go into alert mode, but the man quickly put the gun thing down and smiled, holding his hands up in a posture of surrender. It won't hurt you, kid, Stewart assured the boy. He started to point the scanner again, but the boy jumped back, poised to run. He was chanting something low under his breath. Stewart turned to his daughter. Watch, he said. He pointed the scanner at the little girl and pulled the trigger. David saw outlines in the girl's face, and as the man passed the gun over the girl's body, he saw strange designs under her clothing. David didn't know what he was seeing. He didn't know bone structure or skeletons, but he saw that the girl wasn't injured. So he calmed and allowed the man to point the gun thing at him. It lit brightly, glaring into his eyes, and David could not see the man behind the bright light. Then the light was gone, and David saw the thin, dark-haired man staring at him. The man's face was doing shock. You're a machine, the man said in awe. But David had a mommy. Machines don't have mommies. I'm a boy, he replied. Amanda was excited. Is he a toy boy? Maybe they could have a toy boy. That would be fun. Then she could have a brother. Stewart was impressed and perplexed. It didn't even seem to know it was a machine. Or was it just a programmed response? What manner of machinery was this? And what the hell was it doing in the pen? This is impossible, Stewart said. They couldn't destroy this thing. It was incredible. My name is David, the machine said softly. And there was something in his face. Stewart looked closer. What expression? What subtlety? And there was something else, something in its behavior. Stewart felt he was looking at something that nobody here had ever seen before. He couldn't let them destroy this thing. David, he said, my name is Stewart. Don't be afraid. Just wait here. I'll be right back. He had explained to them that he could still work. It was just that his lamp was broken. He had broken it on a girder at work, and they had taken him to the forest and left him there. He was still functional. Couldn't they understand that? But the men had placed him on the wheel anyway. They had secured his legs and arms and then left him. The wheel was lifted into the air so the crowd could see him. It was hoisted up by hydraulic pumps, the same kind he had once worked on. He knew what this wheel was for. Below him, another elder was being led into the arena by an organ woman with two men in black. This Mecha was covered by a blanket, so he could not see where he was going. As the Mecha on the quartering wheel watched, one of the cyclists from the forest roared into the arena and sped towards the group. Then the ogre stepped away, yanking the blanket off just as the man triggered his chainsaw into action. In the moment before the old Mecha was sliced in two, in an explosion of electric fire, he looked up and saw his old friend from the forest. The two gazed at each other only for a split second, a nanosecond. Something passed between them in that instant. Something Orga did not know existed in Mecha. Was it understanding? Empathy? Suddenly the wheel on which he'd been suspended jerked into motion, pulling itself apart. It took his limbs apart with it. There was no pain. His receptors had been turned off in the cage. But there was something. Just before the world fizzed away in a sudden flash of chaotic signals and alarms, there was a flash of something. Something bright. The man called Stewart had told him not to be afraid, that he wouldn't let the big men destroy him. But David was still afraid because Stewart had left him alone, and they had taken Teddy with them. One by one, Mecha were being let out of the cage. They had gone peacefully, without complaint or argument. David had watched them being ripped apart, shot through flaming hoops of fire, and smashed into propellers of giant fans. It was too much for his mind to handle. The pain was a constant presence now. Behind it was a maze of complex data that needed to be sorted out later. But would there be a later? After some time, Stewart did come back, and he was not alone. He brought another, a thick-bodied man with a large black hat and long black coat. The man had a rugged, scarred face and thin slits for eyes, and even though he smiled, his face looked angry. Lord Johnson eyed the thing that the man had brought him to see. Damn if it didn't look like a real child. Or hadn't he even told about this before? He sat on the ground next to the thing. It cringed away from him. What was this? Fear? Some new device to garner mercy? Not tonight, boyo. Not tonight. This is the one I was talking about, Stewart said, gesturing to David as if he was presenting an award. Johnson just grunted, staring at the simulator. Stewart wondered if the look of fear on the robot's face was having an effect on Johnson. He'd never seen a mecha do that before. There was a quick scuffling behind them, and both men turned to see a withered and broken-looking robot trying to make its way towards them. All that remained of its head was its faceplate, and its arms and torso were chipped tubes of metal covered by a deteriorating piece of cloth. A pitbull was trying to lead it towards the door. Stewart noticed the boy mecha smiling at the old robot in some form of recognition. "Let her go," he said. Johnson started to object, but his curiosity overcame him. The nanny came to them and knelt next to David. She'd been constructed for very specific reasons, and her brain functioned within well-defined parameters. But she realized now that David was not Orga, but was like her. She had also finally understood what the proceedings tonight were all about. She wished she could stay and protect him, but it was her time. "Goodbye, David," she said, smiling gently at the boy. She'd never known how to frown. David watched as the pitbulls led her away. They were going to destroy her now. Why? What was the pattern? The two Orgamen did not see what was behind the exchange between the mecha. Orga rarely noticed such things. After the old robot was gone, Stewart cupped David's chin in his hand. "No one builds children. No one I know of anyway," he said. He felt a precise rendering of jawline and musculature beneath David's skin. What would be the point? He wondered aloud. David pulled away from the man's investigation. He watched the pitbulls leading the nanny into the arena. Stewart thought perhaps it was programmed to attach to symbols of security, maybe some manner of familiarity routines that made it attached to the maternally programmed nanny. Perhaps. Johnson grunted as he eyed the mecha. He pushed his wide black hat back on his head. "Could be a custom job," he said. "Maybe some rich and lonely scaredy-puss's pretend child." "I'm a custom job," a gruff mechanical voice boomed behind them. The men turned. It was an old mecha whose face was displayed in a video port in its neck. 75 years ago, I was Time Magazine's Mecha of the Year, it claimed. Johnson snorted and turned his back on the old thing. "No, this is pretty specialized," Stewart said. He pulled on David's chin, trying to get the mecha to look at him, but its eyes followed the nanny mecha as it was being led towards the acid bath. Maybe it's some kind of prototype, Stewart wondered aloud. It's first-rate work, he said. A lot of love went into this thing. David watched the strong man lead the nanny to the large slab of metal. Blinking lights danced around its circular edge. It looked like a fun place. Other robots had been taken to these things, but they had been out of his line of sight. He had not seen what happened to them there. The men had moved the display to the center of the arena now, and David could see them chaining the nanny to it. The people in the bleachers cheered as she was strapped against the thing. "David," Stewart said. The mecha finally looked up at him. "You're unique, David. One of a kind. You know that?" Did it know? There seemed to be some intelligence behind the frightened gaze. Something in there was reasoning beyond the call of its immediate function. "Who made you?" he asked. David's mind got stuck in the same place as when Martin had questioned him in what seemed like another life. Like with Martin's probing, the problem in the man's question was understanding who he was. He was David, right? A boy. Who made boys? "My mommy made me," he replied finally. Lord Johnson winked at Stewart. "Her womb was your factory, eh? One of those built to aspire to the human condition." He'd heard this before, or at least he convinced himself that this was no different from the claims of organists he'd heard from other simulators. But he was wrong. No other machine had decided its own nature based on its own self-defined logic. But as ever, Johnson was not swayed by his lack of insight. "What was the name of your maker?" he probed. "Serve US? Easy Living?" The robot did not respond. "Robbie,ville? Simulate City? Cybertronics? Sidekicks?" "Monica's my mommy," David replied. Johnson pondered this a moment. He nodded at Stewart, and the two men left the Mecha sitting by the bars, still watching the nanny. She smiled at him from where she stood, bound within the metal circle. For that moment, David was taken away from the inexplicable destroying he had seen. He thought of the sounds she had made at him earlier, the song she had sung to him softly in the net. It reminded him of Mommy's gentle voice. David smiled back at the nanny. Above her, men were pouring something into the buckets balanced atop the large oval display. "So what's your point?" Johnson asked when they were away from the Mecha. Stewart was nonplussed by Johnson's obvious lack of understanding of what they'd just witnessed. The Mecha's insistence that it was born of Orga had caught Stewart's attention, but Johnson didn't seem to get it. Something was strange here. Did it even know it was Mecha? "Don't you see?" he started. I mean, the thing thinks it's Orga." But Johnson just waved his hand to dismiss the point. "Easy enough to program," he said. "I fail to see the importance of that particular gimmick." "I think it's more than that," Stewart said quickly. "And did you see the work on the body design? I can't even see a seam on him. And the infrastructure, the skin texture. It's amazing. Aren't you at least curious about it?" Johnson humped. "The lover model looks seamless enough. You don't seem too concerned about that one." Stewart just shook his head. "I know that series. I've seen them before. This is different. I've never seen anything like this. I mean, the facial expressions alone. Don't they tell you this is a piece of art?" The Orga in the stand started throwing things, little hard things, at the circular extensions of metal that protruded from the sides of the oval to which the nanny was strapped. David watched this curiously. Was it a game? What were they trying to accomplish? An audience member finally struck the bullseye, and the acidic metal solvent fell down on the nanny. David watched horrified as the acid ate her alive. She still smiled at him. She smiled until her face had melted into a running mass of metallic clumps. As her mind fizzled into the black void, she smiled to the little Mecha that he should be brave and not be afraid of what was their lot. She had not been programmed for any thought like this. David watched her frame dissolve until it was only shoots of metal bone, burnt down to the waist. Smoke and sparks were rising from what was left of her. He was afraid again. "You're thinking of not putting him in the show?" Johnson asked. And that's when Stewart realized his boss was an irrational zealot. "Something as original as this, you don't throw it out with the rest of the garbage," he said, in an angrier tone than he had intended. But Johnson didn't seem upset by this insubordination. He made his usual sneer and reached into his coat pocket. "Well, I see originality without purpose is a white elephant. But if money is your purpose..." He folded a wad of new bucks into Stewart's hand. "Then here's your refund. My compliments." Stewart watched unbelieving as Lord Johnson grabbed David's perfect little arm and began to drag him out of the cage towards the arena. What beautiful work, he thought. What a waste. What an idiot. David felt the big man suddenly take his wrist and pull him towards the exit of the cage. What was he doing? Where were they going? Then he knew. He had to find help, but Nanny was gone. Who would protect him now? Then he saw the man Mecha standing near the edge of the cage, the elegant one in the black suit. Joe had been watching the destruction of the rejects. He had no reaction to this. They had obviously outlived their purpose. The Orga were probably going to scrap them for new parts. That's what they did. Then suddenly someone grabbed his hand again. He looked down and saw that it was the same little boy who'd grabbed him before. Then he quickly realized that it wasn't a boy at all. Check that. Well, that was interesting. What now? Johnson ignored the fake boy when it started muttering something under its breath. Then he felt its resistance. He turned to see that the boy had grabbed the loverbot's hand and was trying to pull itself back into the cage. Johnson ignored how real the little heated palm felt against his own. Let go of it, he ordered the lover thing. Joe tried to comply with the Orga's command, but the little robot had a vice-like grip on his hand. It was muttering something rapidly. Was that the fear look? Very convincing. Very Orga. But its grip was pure Mecha. I cannot, Joe said. "Let go now!" Johnson yelled. He didn't tolerate uppity robots. "I'm trying, sir. He won't let go." "Well, sit yourself," Johnson said, and then he yanked so hard that Joe was pulled along with David. Stewart followed the struggling trio out of the cage. "What are you going to do with him?" he yelled. "I'm going to put him where he belongs," Johnson sneered. "In show business." Joe heard the man refer to show business. He knew show business. "So that's why they had him here." "Well, it was certainly my good fortune running into you," Joe said, as he let himself be pulled along with the little organ-looking thing. David's plea rose in intensity. His eyes made a futile plea to the man Mecha, who did not seem to understand what was happening. They passed some of the big men who were dragging something ruined and broken through the dirt. David recognized the dark cloth that had once wrapped her old frame. He let out a cry and fell to the ground, trying to resist the big man's pull. But it made no difference. The massive Johnson dragged him along through the dirt, and Joe followed willingly, oblivious to the doom that was awaiting them both at the hands of the hungry mob.